You think you know what slavery looked like in history. You were taught about Atlantic plantations, the Middle Passage, bodies in chains crossing an ocean. You've seen the movies and felt the appropriate horror. But what if that picture is only a narrow window, a sliver of a much longer night? What if there was a continuum of slave-taking that ran not for 4 centuries, but for more than a millennium across Afro-Eurasia? An economy of bodies and loyalties that reached from the oases of the Sahara to the arsenals of the Bosporus, from Red Sea harbours to Black Sea ports, from court schools to salt marshes. The claim sounds like provocation until you open the ledgers and the law books. Ottoman fiscal registers from the 14th century, Arabic and Persian legal compendia reaching back to the 7th, traveller diaries, monastic chronicles, excavation reports. The paper and the earth have been speaking in a steady voice for a very long time. This is not the version that fits easily inside survey courses, partly because it defies the one-book summary. Its chronology is long, its geography plural, its mechanisms layered, partly because any honest telling must be careful with words that have been weaponized in the present. But the evidence exists, and it is stubborn. It shows systems that conscripted children for soldiering and administration, caravans that moved human beings alongside gum arabic and ivory, tax codes that made identity a calculation, and, at times, campaigns and policies that hollowed temples, libraries, and languages. It also shows variation, pauses, reforms, oppositions from within, and lives that dart in and out of the record with jolting specificity. We will not paint with a brush so broad that it turns history into accusation. We will do something harder, name dates, places, mechanisms, and let them stand. Before we go any further, a clarification about terms, because definitions decide what we can see. When pre-modern jurists wrote about Reich, bondage, Mamluk, the owned soldier, Jariya, a female slave, or about jizya and kharaj, poll and land taxes, they were not using our modern moral vocabulary. But their rulings structured lives all the same, and their paperwork, court receipts, bills of sale, manumission deeds, tax surveys, structures our sources. Likewise, when imperial scribes across the Ottoman domains recorded a devşirme, child levy, in the Balkans, they were producing administrative normalcy out of family catastrophe. We will keep the anachronism police satisfied where it matters, no retroactive criminal codes, but we will not use antiquity as anesthesia. A child torn from a threshold is a child torn from a threshold, no matter what the chancery called it. This series will braid 3 strands through the narrative. First, extraction of bodies, how boys became soldiers and administrators, how girls became domestics or concubines, how men were funneled into courts, garrisons, workshops, and quarries, and why specific ages, statures, and origins commanded specific prices. Second, extraction of labour, the routes that made captivity possible, trans-Saharan, Indian Ocean, Black Sea, Danubian, and the attrition they built into the cost of doing business, the camps where salt ate skin, the estates where the mathematics of endurance were calibrated. Third, extraction of culture, the fiscal and legal tools that made conversion a survival strategy, the closures and conversions of institutions, the long, slow pressure that persuades a language to retreat from market to courtyard, to prayer to silence. Each strand will have its date stamps and its complicating footnotes. Together, they make a machine. You will hear claims that everything here is suppressed, that curriculums have conspired to hide a 1400-year record. The quieter truth is less cinematic and more structural. Sources live in languages fewer students read. Archives sit far from the syllabi that train teachers. Geopolitics makes some topics painfully charged. and scholarship itself is divided into silos, Indian Ocean studies here, Ottoman fiscal history there, that rarely talk to one another on television. We will keep the temperature low and the detail high. When evidence is strong, we will say so. When numbers are inferred, we will show our math. When a chronicler brags or a missionary exaggerates, we will note the angle of the pen. None of this is an indictment of faith as faith, nor an absolution, because it was a different time. The people in these pages moved inside empires that spoke in religious law, imperial convenience, and commercial arithmetic in roughly equal measure. The Atlantic world, the Roman world, the Chinese world, the steppe confederations, every large political organism built some version of unfreedom into its metabolism. Naming that universality does not dissolve particularities, it keeps us honest. Our task is to stay with particulars long enough for the patterns to reveal themselves without turning them into slogans. So, what will you see? You will stand on a packed earth square and watch officials measure suns against their outstretched hands. You will follow a caravan that counts its captives as carefully as its camels and calculates acceptable loss between oases. You will read a steward's memo about opening windows in precise combinations to manage a palace's air, because scent can undo ceremony, and a tax collector's neat note about a boy who converted so his sisters could eat. You will step into a scriptorium that goes quiet, not because the scribes are pious, but because they are dead and the books are ash. You will open account books and see a unit of value turn out to be a child. There is a reason the story is dangerous, and it is not because documents are scarce. It is because once you see how long a machine can run, how ordinary its parts can look, the consolation that all atrocities are spasms begins to dissolve. A plague burns through in months, a war lasts years. A system that learns how to sustain itself by distributing reward, by promising advancement to a few, by turning coercion into ritual, can last your lifetime and your grandchild's. That is the unsettling thing, not the sharp horror of a single battle, but the dull durability of rules and ledgers and gates. We will move slowly and keep our eyes level. Where the competitor's script roars, we will let the room speak. The bell that rings in a Balkan village, not for Sunday liturgy, but as an alarm. The hush in a house as fathers hide coins under floorboards that cannot bribe a system designed not to be bribed. The scrape of a stylus as a clerk records healthy, tall, intelligent beside a boy's new name. The mother who sets a place every evening for someone who will not come home. An army decades later marching back through the same valley, led by the child she lost. We will show also the other rooms, the palace school where a conscript learns languages and law and climes, the chancery where a convert drafts orders that will shield some and harm others, the chapel where survivors decide that memory is something you have to practice the way you practice a craft. If you have been told that a 1,400-year trade dwarfed the Atlantic one, you will be tempted to convert grief into a contest. Don't. The point is not arithmetic as accusation, but chronology as comprehension. The Atlantic catastrophe lasted roughly 4 centuries and left descendants who can, and do, speak with authority about what was done to their ancestors. The networks we will follow waxed and waned across more than 1,000 years, and were often designed to prevent descendants who remember. That is why they can be hard to see at a glance. That is also why we will stay, scene by scene, with the mechanisms that made forgetting part of the plan. If you are still with me, you are ready to watch the first gear turn. Picture a valley in 1515 and the way sound carries there. A bell begins to ring before dawn. not for mass, but to warn. Doors open, then slam. Mothers count sons and try to make time thicker by touching foreheads, by pressing bread into hands that won't be allowed to keep it. Officials arrive with lists and a practiced calm. They will test teeth and posture, check skin and height and reflex. They will speak in the grammar of inventory. Some boys will be rejected for a scar or a limp, for being too old or too small. Some fathers will try to fail their sons on purpose. Some fists will fly and then fall. Somewhere, a clerk will write a name that is not the one the boy heard at his baptism. The machine wants bodies and futures both, and it is polite enough to bring forms. We will stand at the edge of that square long enough to see the procedure become a story, and the story become policy. And then we will follow one boy out of the village and ask, step by step, how a levy turns a child into a lever that can move empires. The bell in the valley keeps ringing after the soldiers arrive because sound buys seconds, and seconds are what parents have left. Men in quilted coats and red caps come up the lane with a clerk who does not miss a line. Names, fathers' names, parish, age guessed by bone and tooth. Boys are gathered in the square where weddings and wakes are held. They are told to stand straight. A measuring cord appears, the sort carpenters use. The official with the list has learned to read shoulders and jaws the way horse traders read hocks. Too thin, too soft, too old. He taps a chest, pinches an earlobe, asks a question, and watches the eyes more than the answer. Strength matters, but so does something harder to inventory: attention, quickness, the capacity to be taught. When he finds it, he marks the page. The scene is not chaos. That is the genius and the horror of a levy practiced for generations. A priest tries to speak and is waved aside politely. He will be needed later to calm what can't be stopped. A mother falls to her knees and offers the sum total of her life: bracelets, a cow, a rug with her grandmother's dye in it. The official is not cruel. He is unmovable. He quotes the regulation about how many boys per hearth, about the ages sought this year, about fines for substitution. It is written, he says, and somewhere in a chancery, a version of the same sentence has been copied 100 times. A father produces coins built from 20 years of hiding them under floorboards, and then, when nothing moves, he lunges with his hands. He is beaten in front of his boy, not as lesson exactly, but as proof the rule does not bargain. A clerk notes a bruise on his own wrist and continues to write. We tell the story of a levy as if it were only theft, and for those standing in the square it is exactly that. But the system that takes sons also promises a path for some of them, a palace school where the best will learn languages and arithmetic and strategy, a barracks where bodies will be forged in the same way swords are, a household where a clever child can become a man with seal and signet. The word used in the register is kul, a servant of the Sultan, which in practice means an existence cut off from kin and past, but threaded to power. The Ottoman chroniclers will later praise the product more than the process: discipline, loyalty, a core that does not owe provinces or patrons, and therefore answers only to the centre. None of that makes the square hurt less. If you want a life arc that proves how thoroughly allegiance can be rewritten, follow one boy from a Drina-side village whose family name was once Sokolovich and who becomes Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. The story is told and retold, taken in childhood, trained in palace and field, rising by talent and the favour of sultans until he is Grand Vizier. He returns in stone rather than flesh, sponsoring a bridge where his river bends. Some read in the arch a memory softening into beneficence. Others note that bridges are not only for return but for moving troops and taxes faster. The same span that brings merchants also makes levies and campaigns efficient. He has become, by every rational measure of the system, its triumph. What happens in the square is not the same everywhere or every year. There are reigns with frequent devşirme and reigns with long pauses, exemptions carved out for certain towns, trades, or confessional groups, seasons when the demand is for taller boys, others for younger. The levy tends to prefer the countryside, where bonds of clan and parish are strong enough that taking one boy can discipline 10 families. Some years it is a handful from a district, in other years a sweep. The record in chancery hands makes it look like administration. The record in village memory makes it feel like a storm that learns your house. Selection follows a choreography that has been written down and revised. Unmarried, no visible defects, no obvious illness, the right balance of strength and pliancy. A boy who answers too quickly may be marked as clever in a way that delights a tutor. A boy who stares at his feet may be sent back to his mother. There are simple tests, a riddle, a counting task, a stick thrown to see reaction, because empire is selecting not only for shoulders, but for synapses. The ones chosen are renamed, parcelled, marched. At a ford, a woman runs after the column with a loaf of bread and is pushed back, not violently, just with the practiced pressure of men who have seen this same scene in 100 parishes. Some places become legends of loss. A ridgetop village in the 1460s is remembered as losing all its boys between 8 and 18 in a single round, and in the next generation the fields go sour because there are not enough hands. Houses are found years later with tools where they fell, altars dusty rather than stripped, as if the village's departure was not planned so much as conceded. In other places, the hollowing is slower. One son is taken in a family, but not the next. An uncle converts, hoping to lower the household's burden. A cousin is recruited into an artisan guild in the city, and the leaving happens without drums. Numbers tempt us to certainty. You will hear estimates ranging into the hundreds of thousands across centuries, and there are years when levies are heavy and years when they are barely a rumour. What the archive does show is the shape, a pipeline that begins with selection, passes through a period of isolation and language training, and then branches. The most promising go to the palace school, the Enderun, where they learn law, protocol, calculation, and the delicate art of reading a ruler's face. Others join the standing infantry, the Janissary Corps, once famous for its iron discipline and celibacy, later famous for its politics. Others still become craftsmen in imperial workshops or servants in elite households. The crucial step is the same for all. The old name is set, a side and an obedience taught so thoroughly that it can be mistaken for love. Parents learn the rules and try to bend them. Some hide sons with kin in higher valleys and bring a younger cousin to present as an only child. Some smear ash to dull a complexion, or cut a tendon to make a limp, or crush a finger so the hand looks less useful, acts of damage attempted as mercy. A few, in later centuries, when the janissary reputation begins to mean pay and power, will try the opposite and push boys forward with bribes. Systems that begin as compulsory can become aspirational at the edges once they create a clear ladder. None of this cancels the day the bell rings. What of faith? The levy gathers Christian boys and requires that they be converted and trained within the imperial household. It also brings the undeniable fact that some of these boys, now men with Ottoman names and Ottoman educations, will sit in rooms making decisions about the places where they were born. There are moments of remembered origin, an endowment for a church repaired under a new patronym, a road paved near a childhood pasture, but the machine prefers clean lines, the sultan's servant, the state's son. It is not brainwashing in the way modern films would draw it. It is patient apprenticeship to a different set of loyalties, enforced by distance and reward. We also have to say what is less comfortable for simple narratives. There are suspensions and reforms. There are sultans who rely less on the levy and more on other recruitment. There is the 17th century ossification when janissaries, once celibate, marry and put their sons forward, turning a merit pipeline into a hereditary lobby. There are borderlands where the levy barely touches and others where it returns like a season. Systems shift because they are made of people, and people learn how to game rules. Still, the square returns. A boy about 13 watches his father's blood making mud and files the moment where he will keep it, and 20 years later he stands in a different square with a ledger and checks for posture and teeth. This is not a myth. It is a mechanism. An empire cannot be everywhere at once, so it builds instruments that can be. A levy does more than fill barracks. It rethreads kinship. What remains in the village after the column turns, the bend are ledgers and echoes. There is the church, whose bell will ring again next Sunday because people still need to live. There are fields that will be ploughed with older backs, or not at all. There is a mother who sets a place at table and keeps setting it, because doing so is the only way a room can hold space for a name that is no longer safe to speak aloud. There is also paper, tax registers that will now assess fewer adult males. Court notes about a dowry renegotiated because a brother is gone. A petition to a governor asking for remission because the household labour has been altered by policy. The archive will preserve those lines dry as salted meat, and we will need them in a moment. For now, we stay with the square until the column disappears and the bell quiets. We have seen selection from the front of the line. In the next part, we will walk behind it, through the paperwork, to count the blank spaces that policy leaves behind. Abandoned thresholds, fields gone to thistle, handwriting that stops mid-sentence because the hand that wrote it has been marched away. When the column has gone and the road quits echoing feet, there is a second kind of inventory that begins. It is quieter, and its handwriting is neater. A parish scribe adds a line to a register. Fewer adult males this season. A tax clerk crosses out a name and shifts the household's assessment because labour has changed. A notary copies a petition that asks the district governor for remission on grounds of unexpected depletion, a phrase so clean it could pass for weather. Bureaucracy is often accused of making grief banal. What it does with particular efficiency here is to make it legible. Stand in the doorway of a house on the ridge, and the damage is not metaphor. A plough waits for a pair of shoulders that have been walked away under escort. The earth has learned the stride of a single ox, and the furrows show it. A spindle lies where a hand dropped it to run. On a shelf, a clay oil lamp is still sooty, because no one thought to wash it in the panic of mourning. The door itself has a habit of being left ajar. Someone will be back any moment. That is how the room speaks to itself. Not all villages become legends of emptiness in a year. Many thin slowly, giving up sons to barracks and workshops and city guilds over a decade until the fields learn to expect old backs or go to thistle. A few do vanish almost at once. Houses left with embroidery still in frames, tools in half-dug furrows, a chapel with a candle gutted mid-prayer. Archaeologists will later find them and write cool notes about abrupt abandonment phases. The villagers would have called it running out of boys. Paper tells a parallel story with lines that do not smudge. The Tahrir Defters, the great cadastral surveys of the empire, list hearths, crops, obligations. Read one in sequence and you can watch a district take on a different shape. Fewer households assessed for male labour, more widows and mothers of conscripts listed as heads, acres leased to neighbours because a bequest cannot stay in a family without a son to inherit. In the margin, a note about newly converted and the corresponding drop in dues, which is the fiscal way of saying that a boy's choice farther down the road has bargained next harvest back into the mouths of his sisters. The book does not say that aloud. It implies it with arithmetic. Stories remain that are too human for ledgers, and therefore survive as quotes in other people's hand. They took my Marco when he had just learned to lift a sheaf, a father is recorded, a saying in a petition for relief. His mother has not spoken since. There is a woman who sets a place at table every evening for 30 years and talks to the absent as if names could keep time honest. It is very likely that such details entered the archive because someone needed to justify a tax abatement, not because the state craved pathos. The result is that the pathos is preserved. We are tempted to imagine the levy as a storm that arrives identically everywhere. It did not. There are districts with exemptions carved out by old privileges, towns that provided substitutes from among hired migrants, valleys too remote or too barren to be worth the climb, rains with frequent child gatherings and rains with long pauses, officials who enforce criteria to the letter, and others who wink at bribes from families desperate to fail their sons. Yet even where the practice is sporadic, the idea of it can hollow a place out. Parents marry daughters earlier. Families send a son to an uncle in the hills until the rumour passes. Certain names, Andrea, Nicola, Petar, become scarcer in a generation simply because children are named after uncles who are still present to hold them. The selection logic that felt like humiliation on the square makes sense again when seen on the page where it was born. Boys are to be unmarried. They are to be free of visible defect. They are to be of sound limb and brisk mind. Quickness is prized. Sullenness is a warning. Frank beauty can be an advantage or a risk depending on the year. There are notes in some manuals about preferring the countryside, where bodies have the exact combination of endurance and tractability administrators seek. The modern ear bristles at the word specimen, but the lists are full of it. The child as potential, the potential as state capacity. It is not random cruelty. It is selection written down. What happens to the boys once the ledger transfers them from one column to another is a form of erasure, followed by inscription. They are separated first by language, no mother tongue heard, no village idiom tolerated, and then by routine. They are given new names and new prayers, and punished for the old ones not by spectacle, but by a boredom that wears down resistance, drills, recitations, calligraphy, the precise folding of garments, silence enforced until silence becomes fluency. Older boys are posted to gatehouses and kitchens and stables to learn how courts work from the floor up. The most promising are taken into the palace school, into a curriculum of law, rhetoric and geometry. Many become infantry in the Janissary Corps. In the early centuries, that corps becomes famous for its celibacy and iron discipline. Later, it will loosen and marry and sponsor sons and turn from instrument into interest group. For now, it is the state's most obedient muscle. Parents do what they can to steer fate. We have accounts of small sabotages, boys who appear at levy time with a limp carefully acquired, a finger crushed in a door so the hand fails inspection, ash smeared on a face to dull shine. There are reports, too, in later centuries of the reverse. Families angling for placement once service is synonymous with pay, status, exemption from other forms of dues. Systems mutate as incentives change. The most earnest truth is that whatever families do, they do it in response to math. The harvest that will feed fewer mouths. The tax that will not be remitted unless someone crosses a line. The rumour that this year the inspectors are favouring 14-year-olds and that next year they will prefer 11. Do the villages ever see those boys again? Rarely as sons. Sometimes as men at the head of processions, cavalry jingling into a square whose stones they can still name, or as administrators with lists in their hands where their fathers once stood. There are moments when a benefaction comes back like a benign ghost, a fountain endowed, a bridge raised, a stipend for a priest's pension paid under the new name of someone who remembers the old one. You can read a softness into those gestures if you like. You can also read efficiency. The bridge moves troops as well as trade. The fountain secures loyalty as well as thirst. The demographic effects accumulate like silt, even where the levy is intermittent. Family lines break not all at once, but in the slow way land breaks when no son returns to take title. Property transfers to neighbours of another confession, because inheritance rules do not accommodate a convert. A parish shrinks until the feast day procession is a thin ribbon rather than a cord. Songs forget a verse because no one's grandmother can remember the words. None of this reads as dramatic in a single year. Over a lifetime it looks like a tapestry reduced not by fire, but by moths you cannot see at work. It is easy, standing in the empty doorways, to say that the story ends here with absence. But the pipeline we are following runs on, and it is larger than the child levy. There is another market, older in places, newer in others, that takes adolescent and adult males and moves them along routes where the desert itself becomes a filter. It does not promise advancement in palace schools. Its logic is not apprenticeship to power, but conversion of bodies into price differentials. In some centres along the Nile, and in cities that trade with the Red Sea and the Gulf, there are rooms where a crude operation is performed over and over, because a court somewhere wants gatekeepers who will never build dynasties, and households want servants who cannot father sons. The ledgers for that industry have their own columns and their own arithmetic of loss. We will keep a hand on the village door jamb a moment longer, because memory deserves the courtesy. The bell will ring again next Sunday and the liturgy will be said. A baptism will be recorded in the same neat hand that recorded a son's conscription. The field will be planted late, but planted. But the world that has learned to take boys by rule had also learned to take men by knife, and the road south will teach a different measure of absence. In the next part, we will leave the ridge and follow a caravan to the cataracts, where bodies are processed in the name of safety and service, and the cost is written not in villages thinned over decades, but in graves dug by the weak. Follow the caravan south until the river narrows and quickens, and the maps begin to mark cataracts the way sailors mark reefs. Here, geography becomes procedure. At stations strung along the Nile and the desert roads, the names change with rains and routes, but Aswan recurs in merchants' notes and court stories. Bodies are revalued. Adolescent boys and young men captured in raids or bought on interior markets are sorted, housed, and made to wait their turn before a door. What happens beyond the threshold is described in records with an accountant's cool hand and in memoirs with a survivor's tremor. The language is never the same twice, but one line repeats, "Survival rates were terrible." We should keep our footing in the evidence. Jurists argued over the permissibility of castration. Many forbade it, which is why, in practice, the knife was often held by non-Muslim intermediaries, Coptic surgeons in Egypt, others elsewhere, so that a letter of the law could coexist with a fact on the ground. The reasons were not mysteries disguised as theology. Eunuchs were marketable because they could not father dynasties, because they were believed safe around women, because households and palaces needed gatekeepers and inner chamber staff, whose ambitions would be bounded by anatomy. Courts from Abbasid Baghdad to Mamluk Cairo to Ottoman Istanbul employed them in numbers large enough to require supply lines, and supply lines gave rise to places where the conversion of a boy into a eunuch was industrial in everything but steel and steam. We have ledgers that record price differentials without a flicker of unease. An intact adolescent might fetch one price. The same body, after the operation, would command 2 or 3 times as much if he survived to be brought to market. The grim calculus appeared in balance sheets: purchase cost, transport cost, treatment cost, losses, final sale, net. Insurance exists where risk is predictable. Some routes could be underwritten at one rate for intact cargo and at another for altered, with the policy quietly assuming the deaths that would occur between oasis and market stall. It is a staggeringly frank way to talk about a process that most of the boys did not live to report. The journey itself selected for endurance before any surgeon laid out tools. Raiding corridors out of the Ethiopian highlands or the Sudanic belt aimed for boys between 8 and 14, not because anyone pretended to kindness, but because those ages balanced survival on the march with malleability and training. A desert will kill you with indifference, and caravans learn to move on from those who fell behind. Between interior capture and Nile or coastal centres, mortality could run to 1/3 or more in hard seasons. Then came the room. The memoirs that survive are rare and liable to retrospect, but there is a shape that overlaps them, a threshold, a smell of oil or wine or herbs, meant to make a crude theatre feel like a clinic, a waiting space where boys stare at the floor because looking up would admit that the eyes across from them are the same age. One account by a man later known in European records under a name he did not choose describes watching rows of cots as if they were a field of dice being rolled. It was a manufactory of angels, he writes with the bitterness of someone who has learned to joke in order not to remember. He lived to govern a household. He did not forget the boys who did not. In some seasons and centres, contemporary observers reported survival rates so low that only 1 in 10 walked out of the room. Elsewhere, with more skilled hands and better aftercare, more lived. Numbers cannot be firm when the business interest, the legal scruple, and the shame to speak all conspire against counting, but the pattern is not ambiguous. The operation killed at appalling rates, and the machine kept running because the premium for a surviving eunuch paid for the dead. Archaeology adds its mute testimony in the form of pits near way stations and towns that served as processing points. Male skeletons clustering in teens and early 20s, deposition consistent with hurried burial, sometimes with shackles or fittings nearby. No names, no markers, just data that align with routes known from texts and distances that match caravan stages. Excavators write in the language of layers and intrusions, but the story they tell is not abstract. This is where a segment of a market's losses were interred. The system's inventiveness was not in its rituals, but in its logistics. The same networks that moved ivory, gum, ostrich feathers and gold moved captives along the Nile to Cairo and beyond into the Mediterranean, east by Red Sea, dhows to Jeddah, Aden and the Gulf, north through the Sahara to Tripoli, Tunis and Algiers, out of the Black Sea via Kaffa and other ports, in cities where palaces concentrated power, eunuchs stood at the hinge points, at doors to women's quarters and at the thresholds to rulers' inner rooms. That is not a metaphor. In many courts they literally controlled access, and access is where decisions begin. Without heirs of their own, their fortunes rose and fell with those they guarded. Some became immensely powerful, administering estates and directing communications in chambers where public officials could not go. Others struggled, more anonymous than their titles suggest, subject to household rivalries, episodic purges, and the quiet violence of rooms no chronicle cared to detail. If you attempted to say that their lives were at least secure if they survived the room, You are thinking like an accountant. Their security was someone else's project. Eunuchs could be manumitted after years of service and could themselves own slaves and property in certain times and places. But they lived inside hierarchies whose rules they did not write. The physical consequences of the operation ranged from manageable to debilitating: infections, urinary complications, endocrine disorders, before there was an endocrine vocabulary. The survival of one body after the procedure does not redeem the graves of the companions buried along the road. What did the law say? Jurists wrestled. Some condemned castration outright. Others contained it by forbidding it for Muslims while tolerating its results, if performed by non-Muslims beyond the fence of formal responsibility. Castrated males were preferred for specific posts. Owners could not undo what had been done. Slave law permitted purchase and sale with a clinical attention to condition that would not be out of place in a veterinarian's handbook. Reformers in later centuries pushed against the trade and its justifications, and the system bent differently in late imperial periods under internal critique and external pressure. To tell that story properly, we will have to slow down later and count decrees and protests. For now, we remain with a core fact. Demand created suppliers, and suppliers built places where human alteration was routine. There is a temptation in telling this chapter to centre palaces, because palaces are photogenic. Gated courtyards, quiet tiles, women glimpsed and not seen. But if you keep the camera in the inner apartments too long, you miss the trail. The heart of the system is not velvet, it is root. It is the line of boys tied at the wrist, the manager who decides how far to push in a day because water is a fixed quantity, the camel that stumbles and the decision to lighten the load, the factoring house that extends credit on bodies the way it extends credit on salt. Markets in Cairo, Damascus, Basra and Istanbul are endpoints. The machine is the road. Why dwell here, and why now? Because what we will see in the next chapter, the salt marshes that killed as a matter of routine, the desert corridors measured in expected loss, the island markets that treated children as commodities to be transshipped, makes more sense when you understand that no single practice stood alone. The child levy filled regiments and schools and administrative posts. The eunuch trade supplied households and palaces with specialized staff and gatekeepers. Other captives moved to labor where death was the ordinary outcome and the ledger had a column for it. To watch one gear turn is to feel a system. To watch three at once is to understand how hard it is to stop a machine that produces profit at multiple points along its route. We will leave the door of the room closed because the details inside are not necessary to the point and because there is dignity in refusing voyeurism. We know enough to proceed. The premium for a surviving eunuch amplified demand. The desert and the blade conspired to keep numbers of survivors low. The value of those who lived rose with their scarcity, and the people who paid the difference did not need to know the names of the boys. Ahead lies the geography of attrition, oases that serve as ledgers, salt flats that eat skin, markets that balance books with other people's breath. The road will do the talking. Follow the line of camels west until the dunes begin to breathe and the horizon stops pretending to be near. A caravan master does arithmetic with the sky, distance between wells, number of skins, the rate at which a human body yields water to air. The captives march wide-eyed in the light that flattens everything. They are counted at dawn and again at dusk, because you cannot invoice what you cannot number. Between oases, the desert enforces its own tariff. A levy in flesh the accountant back in the city will call loss, and the camel driver will call heat. The routes are old enough to have their own memories. From the savannah belts northward to Fezzan and Tripoli, from Kanem Bornu toward Gadames and the coast, from Darfur through Dongola to the Nile, from the Horn by Dhow across water that looks kind until the wind turns and then becomes a ledger of small mistakes. Names shift with centuries and sovereigns, but the logic holds. Oases strung like beads, fortified wells where a caravan survival depends on a gatekeeper's favour, the arithmetic of resting a day too long and running out a day too soon. Where terrain narrows people's choices, trade grows disciplined and cruel. A road is not just geography, it is policy stretched out in time. There are tolls at passes, customs at gates, brokers who are part notaries and part gamblers. There are safe houses where someone owes someone a favour from 10 years ago, and therefore a chain can be hidden for a night. There is a foreman who understands that if he keeps 2 boys alive, he will recover the value of 8 who did not make it, and who therefore decides, with a merciful face, whom to give extra water. The accounts written later will tidy this up. Purchase cost, transit, guards, feed, loss in transit, sail, net. But in the sand, the math is in breadth and steps. East and south, the water routes bind shorelines to the same economy. Dhows ride the monsoon between the Swahili coast and the ports of Arabia and the Gulf, carry beads and cloth out, bring captives and ivory in. On a good crossing, the sea is a comfort after the march. On a bad one, it is a crowded hold and a prayer, not to be singled out by a storm or a sailor in a mood. Island markets, most famously on a coral stone outcropping, that became synonymous with trade in people, sought bodies with the same smoothness that cloth is graded by thread count, age, sex, strength, skills claimed or inferred, price. Visitors who liked to write were nauseated and very precise. Administrators were only precise. If you stand not by the sand routes but on the southwestern edge of Mesopotamia, where the rivers slow and seep, you meet another landscape of extraction, salt marsh and clay. There, over a century when caliphs had palaces and poets, the labour demanded in the marshes 8 men. The work was to dredge and carry, to scrape salt from poisoned earth and cart it away until the soil could be taxed. Chroniclers, even those writing to flatter, do not disguise the conditions, rations small, water brackish, overseers indifferent because replacements were cheap. It is from this crucible that a revolt rose, tens of thousands at least, perhaps far more, led by men who said the misery would stop. It did not stop. It burned for more than a decade before it was crushed. The camps emptied and filled again. That is the thing about an economic logic. When one cohort is broken, the plan is to find another. Archaeology is cautious, but it has a way of confirming what prose tries to soften. Along some desert corridors, the earth yields strings of burials near wells, bones of boys and young men clustered at ages that match what brokers preferred. Along the marshes, pits expand into ossuaries. Chemical traces and sediment tell of salt and ash. Tool marks show labour that did not stop until hands did. The reports are written in the language of layers and dates, but the quiet of the trenches is the same as the quiet after a column turns a bend. Absence is a shape you can learn to see. We say mortality as if it were an abstract noun. Caravan masters wrote it into their pricing. Insurers folded it into premiums. Merchants spread risk by owning fractions of people the way they owned fractions of ships. On some trans-Saharan legs, especially the long sandy gulfs between wells in harsh seasons, loss could run so high that a quarter or more of a group failed to reach the next line of palms. On water, storms and disease did the work the sand had done. Numbers float in the record, harder here, softer there, worst in drought, but the structure is firm. Roots employed, loss the way mills employ friction. everyone involved learned what could be borne without collapsing the margin. It is at this point that comparison with the Atlantic system creeps into the modern ear. Resist the impulse to turn grief into a contest. The ocean crossing west was a finite, brutal corridor attached to plantation regimes that built communities despite everything, descendants who could speak, sing, and insist on memory. The networks we are following now stretched across more time and more landscapes and often fed institutions that were designed to prevent lineages. That is one reason descendants are thinner on the ground. The other is that mortality, by blade and by landscape, was part of the cost of doing business. You can hold both truths at once without diminishing either crime. Sometimes the machine reveals itself in an administrator's bland sentence. In a regional office, a clerk notes acceptable loss for the dry season route between two oases, as if he were tallying spoilage of grain. In a port log, a buyer notes a higher price for a boy altered to be, as the euphemism goes, safe for the inner apartments, a premium that in one stroke explains why the room by the cataract never lacked for candidates. In a house account, a steward marks the expense of a new servant against the revenue from a salt estate upriver and draws a tidy line under the sum. You do not need anyone to use the word system to see one. But routes and markets do not run without permission. Behind the camel bells and dockside auctions is sovereign power, governors who farm out tax rights on caravan traffic, garrisons that secure passes, judges who register bills of sale and arbitrate disputes, edicts that ban an aspect of the trade in one decade and quietly tolerate it in the next because revenue decides what can be seen. Ports rise to prominence when administrators favour them, then sink when war, plague or reform shifts the flow. Local rulers strike bargains with raiding bands, keep them at arm's length when foreigners arrive, or bring them inside the palace when they need a deniable arm. The road is a policy written in dust. Even within the logic of markets, there are small rescues that do not flatter anyone enough to make a legend. A guard turns his back for the time it takes to tie a sandal, and a cousin vanishes into scrub. A broker pays above the day's price because he recognizes a scar and remembers a promise. A monk writes a name in a margin so that, if nothing else, a vowel survives. These gestures do not dent the numbers. They are threads in a cloth that would otherwise be entirely coarse. By the 19th century, in some places, the attention of outsiders put parts of the machine under a lens. A European visitor to an island market wrote that he had to force the images out of his head to sleep. Another observed that the traders were more offended by theft than by the trade itself. Their reports helped push policies that would, over time, close specific markets. They also had their own agendas. It's possible to be a witness and a hypocrite at once. None of that alters the weight of the scenes they recorded. The line of children, the man who bargains for his sister, the silence in a house when a cart leaves without wheels squeaking because someone has learned to oil them to keep the neighbours ignorant. What the desert and the marsh teach is not only brutality, they teach efficiency. They show how a route can be managed so that the predictable number of bodies reaches a gate, how a market can balance arrival schedules with demand in cities hundreds of miles away, how a ledger can normalize the dearest thing in the world by placing it between transport and storage. And they show that once you understand human movement as arithmetic, policy can be written to produce outcomes, with or without a chain. Which brings us to the other half of the machine, the one that leaves no tracks in sand and requires no dhow. A governor can empty a village with a levy. He can also thin a community over a generation with a table of rates. A palace can buy gatekeepers with a premium. It can also purchase conversions with a remission stamped at the bottom of a tax page. Not all bondage looks like a line of boys or a room with a knife. Some of it looks like math. In the next part, we will put down the camel staff and pick up a clerk's pen to see how columns and percentages can be made to do the work of shackles, slowly, publicly, and with receipts. Put away the camel staff and pick up a clerk's pen. The page before him is ruled into columns, names, faith, acreage, due, and the ink dries to a sheen that makes poverty look orderly. States do not need chains if tables can be made to do the work of shackles. The pressure is slower, more public, and it leaves receipts. In the vocabulary of pre-modern administration, the words are jizya for the poll tax on non-Muslim adult males, and kharaj for land tax levied on certain soils and tenures. In practice, across provinces and centuries the numbers shift like sand, sometimes light, sometimes crushing, sometimes bargained down after flood or famine, sometimes spiked to break a town's back. The clerk is not a theorist, he copies totals. Begin in a Nile hamlet, because the arithmetic there is legible. A surveyor walks the edges of a Coptic household's plots and tallies a harvest of 100 measures. The kharaj demand this year, set by a governor who has his own sums to meet, claims 70. 30 remain for 8 mouths, seed grain for next season, and charity if the family will keep its honour. The petition that reaches the district office 2 months later uses a phrase that repeats across centuries: unexpected depletion. A note in the margin records 3 small graves as future revenue lost, because a dead child is to the ledger a missing payer. This is not a fable. It is the tone of bureaucratic prose when it forgets to be ashamed. The poll tax is due separately, and, in certain towns, it is collected with theatre. There are sources, many, not all, that describe the ritual of humiliation at the jizya desk. The taxpayer kneels, the collector taps the neck with a rod to symbolize subjection. The receipt is issued. Elsewhere, the exchange is quieter, a handshake across a counter, a seal pressed into wax. Variation matters because policy is not the same in every district or decade, but the effect, whether dramatized or discreet, is to make belonging expensive. A father practices stance and breath, so he will not wince in front of his son. The boy watches anyway. Conscience descends as arithmetic, convert and the rate drops, refuse and the table will keep eating. One household's ledger tells the story without adjectives. An eldest son, calculating that 20 measures cannot feed 8 people through a year, crosses the line the law has drawn and accepts a new confession. The clerk notes a remission in both poll and land dues for the next cycle. The family survives the winter. The sisters live who otherwise would not. The law then asserts a second logic. The convert cannot inherit from his Christian parents under the rules that govern interconfessional succession. When the parents die, the land passes out of the old community's hands. Today is saved, tomorrow has been sold. The line the clerk draws under the column is as straight as a blade. Administrations love tables that look universal and apply locally, like storms. In a mountain village with an Armenian priest, an ambitious governor sets the land dues at a rate no one can meet. Call it 90 of every 100, knowing what the choice will be. A delegation protests. The response is a list of penalties that could be filed under order restored: decimation of resistors, confiscation of weapons, a temporary surcharge that is not temporary, and, to make the point generational, a child levy as punishment. Population registers for the next decade become a dwindling count, 500 to 50, older men first, then women and children, then finally no one left to pay or to resist. The record keeps its voice even when there is no one left to read it. Across the sea to the west, the tables sharpen over centuries in towns where Jews still keep ledgers of their own. The early rate survivable but onerous, then restrictions that fence off trades with margin, then an inheritance regime that scrapes estates at death, then municipal limits that squeeze neighbourhoods, then an edict that says the quiet part aloud, and the last entries in the synagogue's minute book are prayers and inventories of candlesticks before flight. No single generation bears the worst. The pot warms by degrees. The genius of the method is patience. The law is not only taxes, it is regulation that turns energy against itself. A Christian potter pays 60% in layered dues, while his Muslim competitor pays 10%. The cheaper jug, equally glazed, wins by arithmetic. The potter cannot expand, cannot hire apprentices, cannot accumulate tools, and his son learns a lesson more durable than any proverb. Identity here is a cost centre. To thrive is to transfer columns. The same logic governs travel and trade, road fees, bridge tolls, market surcharges, licensing charges for repairing a church roof, side payments for guards who might otherwise inspect with unusual zeal. Death by 1,000 cuts is hyperbole only until you read an assessor's book. Historians will, and must, say what the clerk will not. Rates varied, and not only downward upon conversion. There were remissions in famine years, edicts that reduced burdens, provincial courts where petitions succeeded, pious foundations that fed the poor at tax time, later imperial reforms that commuted the poll tax into a general military substitute, and in the long 19th century abolished confessional levies on paper. The picture is not a monolith, but the method can be seen through the variation as a watermark, policy that normalizes the transfer of wealth and status from one column to another without needing a soldier to stand in a doorway. Numbers in the competitor's speech are large and round because round numbers carry. We will hold to the shape rather than the digits. 50 to 80 out of 100 as a tool to force decisions. 45 rising to 70 rising to more. A village's acceptable loss, written not in bodies but in percentages. The important thing is not which decade a district's rate peaked at which exact figure, but that administrators learned they could tune a community's future with a table, throttle it without spectacular violence, purchase compliance at the price of dignity, reward apostasy with remission that looked to the Father with 7 mouths to feed like reason. An inheritance regime does for memory what the poll tax does for posture. If converting saves today but severs the legal route by which land passes to sons who do not, the estate will move to the column that the law prefers. Compound interest in reverse is the kind of phrase an economist writes. A widow sees it as the field she can no longer lease because title has crossed a confessional border. Repeat the process for 3 generations and genealogies fray the way ropes do when strands are cut one at a time. Because the system is public, it instructs. A boy watches his father kneel at the tax bench. The ritual is there to be seen. A craftsman haggles with a buyer who will not pay the price he must charge. The market is a classroom. A clerk tapping the back of a neck performs a political theory with a stick. Even when the humiliation ceremony is absent, the receipt does the work. You do not need a spectacle if the math is inescapable. It would be easy, narratively, to close this chapter with rage and rest, but the ledger is only half the machine. The other half is the erasure of the things that teach a people who they are when the table is against them. Languages at home, scriptures and commentaries in schools, libraries where boys become scholars, temples that keep a calendar more ancient than any governor's budget. Tax can thin a town. Policy aimed at memory can make a civilization forget it was ever thick. The clerk turns a page. In the next room a scribe sharpens a reed pen over a book whose script he has been taught to name obsolete. In the next part, We will step through those doors where the law meets fire and stone, where temples become other temples, where universities become ash, and where a language leaves the market for the altar for the echo and then for silence. Walk from the tax bench into a room where books live, and listen to how policy meets paper and stone. The first thing you hear is not an argument, it is a hush made by habit. A scribe pulls a reed across his thumbnail to sharpen it, and glances at a decree that says accounts will now be kept in a different tongue. In one sentence, a language moves from the market to the margin. Such shifts do not make smoke, which is why we notice them late. But sometimes the change does come with fire. Begin in Iran after the 7th century, where a religion that had ordered empires, tending sacred flames, blessing kings, teaching a grammar of good thoughts, good words, good deeds, finds itself outside the law's preferred column. Some fire temples are shuttered and mined for stone to build mosques. Others are left to age into vacancy when their funds are confiscated. Still others convert in place, the old sanctum becoming a prayer hall by turning worshippers a few degrees toward Mecca. There are chronicles and later memories that picture priests herded to judgment and the sacred fires doused under watchful eyes. Numbers in those accounts are round and furious. The archaeology is steadier, temple sites that end and mosque foundations that begin in the same earth, inscriptions that change script and language across a century. The Avesta, the Zoroastrian corpus, survives in fragments and commentaries because copying slows when patrons flee. A community walks east to India with what it can carry in satchels, ritual memory, marriage customs, names. In a few generations, the world calls them Parsis, Persians who kept a fire lit in another land. The loss was not simple, not total, and not accomplished in a night, but it was policy-aided and long. The record further east is louder because the men who wrote it intended to be heard. From the early 11th century, chroniclers in Ghazna celebrated a ruler who rode annually into the rich alluvial north of the subcontinent. The prose is polished and proud. Towns sacked, idols smashed, treasures melted, captives taken, temples counted by the hundreds. Some boasts. 50,000 shrines destroyed in a sweep are not plausible geography. Others are precise enough to leave archaeological dents. Somnath, a pilgrimage city on the western coast, appears in every telling. Its wealth, its idol, the long ride home with spoils, a pair of gates taken as trophies. Later empires will make theatre of those gates, remove them, return them, argue about whether they were truly from Somnath at all. The point is not the exact timbers, it is the message. Your God has been reduced to a threshold we step across. Mathura is named by poets and by excavators. Layers of burnt brick, broken temple bases, reused in later construction, coins dispersed like seeds in ash. An inscription found near its ruins records a priest's quick line, "The cries of the stones are in my ears," buried under collapse and recovered centuries later. North of Delhi, at Thanissar, a campaign claims a victory so vast that the dead are counted in round hundreds of thousands. Historians who are not writing to flatter trim the number, but the sack itself is not in doubt. You can argue about arithmetic. You cannot argue with scorched strata. Across a century and then another, waves of raiders and then of conquerors turn plunder into policy. Sometimes a temple becomes a mosque. Sometimes temple pillars are reused as spolia in new buildings. Sometimes a precinct is flattened so completely that later builders quarry in a blank. The pattern is uneven, complicated by rulers who patronize multiple cults when it suits them, and by long intervals of local accommodation. But the target is not accidental. Temples are treasuries, schools and calendars as well as sanctuaries. Break them and a city forgets what day it is. The Gangetic Plain keeps its own ash chronicle. Toward the end of the 12th century, mounted troops under commanders from the northwest rode down on the Buddhist Mahaviharas, great monastic universities, whose libraries had grown for centuries under royal gifts. Nalanda stands in every retelling because ruins sprawl there. Red brick walls, monastic cells, ruined stupas, the platform where a great library once rose. Later legends say the books burned for months. The wind and the structure of medieval stacks suggest days or weeks, not seasons. Either way, ash drifts deep in the excavation trenches. The monks die where they try to hold a door, or they scatter to safer kingdoms and carry a curriculum in their heads. These sackings did not, by themselves, erase Buddhism from all of northern India. Decline had other parents, patronage shifts, doctrinal quarrels, absorption into growing Hindu currents. But steel broke what neglect would have thinned more slowly. If you want to see the negative of a civilization, walk the plan of a library that no longer has a roof. Go west again to the Nile, where the language of the pyramids had become the language of the villages, and then the script of Christians. Coptic was Egypt spoken aloud, written in Greek letters with extra signs to catch the old consonants. Administration moved into Arabic because rulers did. The market followed. Pupils who would be clerks learned to copy in a new hand. Edicts appear in some periods that chastise Copts and constrain churches. Other decades are quieter or even generous. The change does not require bonfires. It only requires incentive. Families use Arabic in the street to buy and sell. They keep Coptic at home to bless and scold. Children are practical and choose the language that pays. After a few generations, Coptic retreats to the liturgy, then to the choir loft, then to the memory of grandparents who sing hymns with vowels their grandchildren cannot pass. A story survives in parish law about the last native speaker, usually pictured as an old woman in a village, though linguists remind us that last is a myth. What we can say is this: the living language fell silent, and a dead language remained in church, pronounced by inference. A line that began on limestone walls ends in a choir where the notes still move, but the grammar sleeps. You will be told numbers here too. Tens of thousands of temples erased by a single hand, millions of volumes gone in a night, priests slaughtered by the cohorts. Some of those totals originate as polemic and get rounder as they travel. Others are quoted from court chroniclers, whose job was to make their patrons loom larger than life. Our task is not to police every digit, but to hold fast to what the ground and the papers agree on. There were campaigns aimed at the institutions that store and reproduce identity: temples, schools, monastic libraries, scriptoria. There were policies that made the old language expensive and the new one cheap. There were rulers who, since revenue loves control, learned to put their prayers where their budgets were. And there were, in every century, exceptions, syncretisms, patronage given across lines, scholars protected because rulers wanted their astrologers to read properly. Complexity does not absolve, it prevents caricature. Erasure does not always dress as flames and sacks. It can look like the erosion of funding streams, endowments diverted from fire temples and mathas to mosques and madrasas, old corporations strangled by new paperwork. It can look like calendars reset so that holy days no longer align with the rhythms of field and guild. It can look like court poets paid to rename a city so often that its previous name sounds foreign in a generation. It can look like ruins that are not ruins at all, just foundations repurposed, pillars cut down, inscriptions built face-in so that their letters press against mortar and are not seen again till a 20th century trench lifts them into light. Not all destruction flowed one way, and not all memory loss was the work of a single faith or crown. That is a sentence that helps us breathe and keeps us from turning sorrow into a weapon. The Romans pulled down shrines and rewrote calendars. Early medieval kings in Europe built churches on local sacred sites to redirect veneration. Empires everywhere prefer their own priests. Naming this reciprocity does not wash the ash from the bricks at Nalanda, or rebuild a village school on the Drina, or teach a child in the Delta how her great-grandmother sang. It only places grief in a human register where we can compare and learn. Why linger here? Because the machine we are describing is not only about bodies, it is about what bodies remember and can pass on. When the places that teach identity are targeted by fire, by confiscation, by language policy, the next generation can be made to forget with less force and more efficiency. A levy empties a square in a morning. A grammar change empties a literature in a lifetime. The first is a shock. The second is a solvent. We will leave the ruins with one small sound, the scratch of a reed pen in a monastery that survived on the edge of a forest because no tax farmer needed the trees there. A monk copies a hymn in a language he knows is dying outside his cloister, and pauses to write, in the margin, the name of a village no longer on any list. Marginalia is stubborn. So are people, and yet markets learn to price silence. The next rooms we enter are not full of ash and stone, but of breathing people sorted like cloth. If palaces and policies can thin a language and break a library, they can also write rules over women's bodies with the same combination of law and logistics. The paper trail is as neat. Invoices, receipts, lists of ages and origins and conditions. We will open those ledgers with care, because the numbers are cold and the lives behind them were not. Begin where the Black Sea turns from slate to mirror, and ships lie at anchor below a town whose name changes with conquerors. Theodosia to Kaffa to Kefe. The wind carries tar and citrus peel and something sweeter, a perfume that merchants dab to make the warehouse air feel less like a warehouse. In a courtyard off the main street, buyers arrive through a side gate at the hour when shadows are long and the day's counting can pass for bookkeeping rather than spectacle. The clerk's board is chalked into columns: age, origin, condition, skills claimed or guessed from hands. And the first line he writes this morning is a girl of 15 from the mountain country east of the sea. He does not know that 15 is the peak of a market's demand curve. He only knows how to keep columns straight. The sorting is practiced to the point of choreography. A broker lifts a chin to see teeth, turns a wrist to check for needle scars that might mean illness, passes a ribbon of cloth before eyes to test focus, asks a word in one tongue, and measures how quickly another comes back. For some buyers, the desired category is obvious. Kitchen labour requires broad shoulders and quick hands. Weaving prefers steadiness and patience. For others, the requirements are euphemized, quiet, decorous, unblemished, and everyone understands without anyone needing to say the word that would make the room ugly even to itself. Prices shift by origin because prejudice has been taught to read faces. Slavic girls fetch one sum this season, Circassian and Georgian another, Nubian and Ethiopian often less. There are lists that survive in chancery and in merchants' notebooks, prices rising and falling with roots, with wars, with rumour. Travellers leave accounts that are blunt because the shock made them blunt. A naval officer sent to discourage trade writes to his superior that he has seen men die without losing sleep, and that nothing prepared him for the salutations at a gate where children are sold by the dozen. A diplomat in the capital uses cipher to record that the noise from the women's quarters carries to his rooms at night, and that he trains himself not to hear. Administrators at court leave a different kind of paper: receipts for purchases for the inner service, inventories of garments and lessons, orders for tutors in language, song, deportment. Somewhere there is a line like this: Received, 12 girls of Circassian origin, said to be between 13 and 16, in good health, written in a hand so neat it looks like a pattern for lace. We must keep our footing between the warehouse and the palace because the second place depends on the first. Behind tall walls, the imperial household is a city with its own law. The women who enter it are renamed. Their hair is cut and their old clothes exchanged. Their language is replaced by the house's lingua franca. They are divided into small companies under older women called kalfas and ustas, taught to walk, and sit and serve in a geometry of corridors, and punished for mistakes in ways the sources hint at, but rarely tally. They live under the eyes of eunuchs who regulate access and time, and under a rule that makes proximity to the ruler the measure that counts. Most will never see him. Many will serve forever as hands and eyes of other women, older favourites, the mother of a prince, the woman whose son has become the heir and is now called Valid Sultan, and can, in that role, run a household like a ministry. A few will be manumitted after years and married to officers as part of the palace's obligation to place loyal servants. Fewer still will bear sons and become protected by a legal category. Walad, the mother of a child by her owner, which in some periods guarantees eventual freedom, but in all periods marks a life defined in the passive voice. The paper grammar is coherent and chilling. Law manuals specify rights of owners over slaves with a clinical care for disposition and condition. Registers of manumission exist beside bills of sale. The same folio might contain a list of fabrics for winter cloaks, a stipend for music lessons, and an order to transfer a woman from one household wing to another, for reasons of harmony, a euphemism that hides what could not be written in a ledger. In palace annals there are hints of suicides, never described at length, never given names, of rivalries that end in poisoning, of punishments that later readers can only guess because the language goes evasive at the edge of cruelty. There are also lines that read like a different genre entirely. A concubine whose son becomes sultan and who then acts as regent for a decade, a freedwoman who builds a fountain complex on a hill and endows a soup kitchen below it, a one-time slave whose seal appears on orders that move money and men. Lives here were not all the same, even as they were governed by the same rules. The market's geography is wider than a single port. Routes in the steppe feed Black Sea marts. Raiding in the Caucasus supplies the same. The fall of one town shifts trade to another as power changes. Inland bazaars in Anatolia and the Levant receive girls purchased in coastal cities and send them on to households we will never see. South and east, island markets on coral outcrops, cities with deep harbours facing the Indian Ocean, and inland towns along caravan lines repeat the same sorting under different suns. When we look for totals in ledgers, we find season-by-season volatility and lifetimes of repetition, thousands in one decade, fewer in another, then more again when war or famine loosens the ties that keep families whole. A single port could pass tens of thousands of people through its gates in a narrow slice of time. A region could do so over centuries and leave behind few communities that remember the names. There is a line the competitor's voice crossed that we will walk back a step. Grand totals presented as fact across. 14 centuries make for strong thumbnails and brittle footnotes. What the record will bear is the structure, sustained demand in courts and households, price premiums for youth and particular origins, a bureaucratic apparatus that routinized the purchase, training and placement of enslaved women, and a legal framework that normalized sexual access as an attribute of ownership. That framework was contested at the edges by jurists and reformed in later periods under pressure from within and without, and, by the last century of empire, Decrees circumscribed the trade until it was a ghost on paper and then prohibited outright. Yet for the women whose names the paper does not keep, the distinctions between reform and abolition blur. The difference is felt by descendants. Where descendants are few because lineages were deliberately broken or absorbed, silence thickens. Even in households far from the palace, the same logic rules. A merchant in a provincial city owns 2 women, one to manage his house, one for his bed. He can manumit one, arrange a marriage she did not ask for as an act of generosity, and sell the other at a loss because a new wife objects. In the next quarter, a man of lesser means rents a servant by the month through a broker. She cooks and cleans and disappears from the record when the family moves. A woman who becomes pregnant without status faces a chain of outcomes that are all simply terrible. If her owner acknowledges the child and she becomes walad, her future is tethered to his. If not, the child may be sold or fostered or drowned quietly out of sight. We read hints of these paths backward. Household inventories that drop a name, court cases that adjudicate the status of a child, the sudden appearance of a manumission deed after years of nothing, as if we were looking at a city's life from its drain pipes. You will hear a story from the Caucasus that is simple and therefore has the hardness of a weapon, that an entire people scarred their daughters to keep them safe from men who priced beauty as a commodity. Folklore carries lines like that because they are true in a sense harder to measure than numbers, true to a climate of fear and to a market's appetite. There are also travellers' accounts of families who sold daughters early to control the terms of what they could not prevent, and of others who scarred cheeks with ash from the hearth because a mark was a poor shield that sometimes worked. When trauma is a unit of exchange, acts of love can look like cruelty from a distance. We can go farther back and find a different kind of ledger, under the rubble of a palace by the Tigris, where a conqueror's army found the last caliph's household, heavy with women whose names nobody wrote. Chronicles that do not flinch from describing massacres go oblique when they come to this part. The women of the household were treated as conquered women are. There are trenches on the palace grounds that archaeologists think contain hurried burials from that week. Bones do not record the words that were said over them. The entry in the conqueror's book would have been a line about plunder tallied, and a city made an example. What do we learn when we stand this long in rooms where everything is priced? First, that the commodification of women in these markets was not a fringe practice, but a pillar of household labour and elite display across regions and centuries. Second, that the same bureaucracy that deodorized palaces and tuned tax rates could teach itself to write about women's bodies in the same tone as it wrote about brocade. Third, that within this scaffolding some women learn to bend rules and survive and even rule, and that these exceptions prove power's preference for systems that leave as few traces as possible. We leave the ledger with 2 images that do not square. The first is a receipt with a seal that says, "A girl exists only because a man bought her." The second is a fountain in a courtyard, paid for by a woman whose first signature in the world was placed on a manumission deed. Historians can footnote both. What we cannot footnote are the millions of ordinary rooms where neither receipt nor endowment survived, and where memory died as planned. The next part will step out of these rooms and into the archive itself, the way scholars find what can be found, the way politics shapes what can be said, and the fights over how to teach any of this without turning history into a weapon or a silence. Open a box in a reading room, and you discover that history has 2 custodians, paper and policy. The paper is older than we expect, thick, burnished, salted with sand from journeys no one recorded. The policy is newer than we like, permissions that expire, budgets that shrink, topics that make administrators nervous. Between them sits the scholar with dull pencil and soft hands, trying to keep the graphite on the page and the temperature out of the sentence. Begin where so much of this story begins, an archive that smells of dust and vinegar glue. A clerk has brought you a register bound in brown, the leather cracked at the hinge. It contains a century of transactions, receipts for people and for pepper, orders for gatekeepers, remissions of tax, manumission deeds folded like birds tucked into nests. The script is practiced, the tone neutral. You copy lines that turn to heat as soon as they touch air. Received, 2 boys, healthy, apt. Transferred, a girl to the inner service. Remitted, dues upon profession of the new confession. You whisper thank you to a hand that wrote 500 years ago without imagining you, and you take notes that will later be read for posture as much as for content. Did you condemn loudly enough? Did you hedge? The box does not care. The box just asks you to read. Next you climb stairs to a room where legal treatises sleep. They tell you what was permitted, what was disputed, what was forbidden in principle and tolerated in practice. Here the jurists quarrel over the castration of slaves, over who may perform it, over the status of a child born to an enslaved mother and a free man. Their sentences are precise and dry, and you have to remind yourself that precision can be a form of mercy if it restrains, and a form of cruelty if it rationalizes. A page later, the same book devotes as much attention to the rules of sale for a donkey as to the sale of a person. The shelves are even-handed. Your stomach is not. Then you stand in a museum storeroom with trays of bones and beads and brick fragments. The archaeologist speaks the grammar of layers and disturbances and shows you where ash has settled in a monastic cell, how salt etches bone in a way that has a laboratory signature, why a trench beside an oasis holds adolescent males in numbers that turn rumour into inference. In a drawer you see a pillar drum that once held up a temple roof and then held up a mosque roof, because stone is practical and politics is impatient. Evidence does not come with captions. People add those later. Across the water, a monastery library offers a hymnal in a language used now mostly for prayer, and even that rarely. A monk smiles as he turns a page, and you read a marginal note, the name of a village that no longer appears in district ledgers. This is how memory refuses gently. It writes in the margin the thing the centre will not preserve. It is not propaganda. It is housekeeping. The competitor's voice called this suppressed. The quieter truth is that history is an obstacle course. Archives were curated by regimes with agendas. Floods drowned county records. Fires took ministries and monasteries alike. Wars made gaps. Languages narrowed the audience. And the habits of our own institutions do the rest. Survey courses in world history have 30 hours to cross continents. Syllabi privilege what's local because it is testable. Museums build exhibits for publics who can drive to them. Editors greenlight topics that fit the present conversation. Area studies departments were funded for decades to serve geopolitical goals. Cold War here, energy there, and they still wear those shapes. Add to this the politics of the present. Fear that honest work will be read as attack. Fear that attack will masquerade as honest work. Scholars learn to step carefully. Teachers choose what they can defend at a parent night. Producers want numbers, not footnotes. None of this is a conspiracy in the Da Vinci sense. Much of it is gravity. There are harder edges too. Some topics draw harassment, some draw threats. A historian who writes plainly about child levies in the Balkans will collect mail that tells him which childhoods count. A curator who assembles an exhibit on eunuchs will learn the difference between curiosity and prurience the hard way. A lecturer who includes a week on trans-Saharan roots will be asked why she hates one civilization. If she omits the Atlantic world, she will be asked if she is covering. Meanwhile, those who came before left us friction of another sort. 19th century travellers who wrote as witnesses and as salesmen, imperial officials who documented abuses with one hand and profited with the other, reformers whose pamphlets are invaluable and saturated with their own politics. Sorting motives is part of the work. So is admitting that motives do not invalidate measurements. How, then, to tell this story without turning history into a cudgel or a shrug? One way is to separate the furniture of the room. Put what we can point to with a finger in one box. Evidence, the ledger line, the decree, the trench. Put what logically follows but cannot be counted precisely in another. Inference, demographic thinning across generations, language shift that leaves prayer but kills lullabies. Put what is asserted but unresolved in a third. Allegation, the round numbers that travel without footnotes, the claims about intentionality that exceed what documents can bear. Move deliberately between the boxes and label your crossings. Anger belongs, but not as a solvent for categories. Another way is to widen the map without erasing contours. Place the systems we have followed alongside other engines of unfreedom in other empires. Roman latifundia, Chinese corvée, encomienda in the Americas, convict labour in settler colonies, plantation regimes in the Atlantic world. Each has its ledgers and its graves. Comparison does not flatten. Difference, it lets us distinguish design features from local decoration. Here, in the networks we have traced, we note especially the ways a bureaucracy tries to prevent the formation of descendant communities who remember. That is a choice, not a destiny. We can also be candid about incentives. Donors shape departments, ratings shape programming, national curricula serve national stories. In one decade, oil money funds chairs. In another, Cold War anxieties fund language institutes. In another, tech wealth endows digital humanities labs. Some gifts soften certain topics. Some commissions sharpen others. The right response is not to pretend that institutions are pure, but to insist that citations are. A footnote is a republic. It admits anyone who can show their paper. Teachers know another constraint: safety. A unit on the Atlantic slave trade can be taught fiercely and well with the support of museums, syllabi and families who have names to speak aloud. A unit on trans-Saharan routes, on castration markets, on household slavery in courts. These demand more scaffolding and more care because the descendants are thinner on the ground, and the present politics will read the past as accusation if you do not hold the map up just so. The answer is not to omit, but to prepare, to name multiple empires, to include internal critics from within the traditions you are discussing, to give vocabulary before judgment, and to tell students exactly how historians know the things they claim to know. Digitization is changing the ground under us. Scans of registers once accessible only by letter and luck now sit on servers. Satellite archaeology can find caravan scars and kiln fields. Geneticists can map movements that corroborate or complicate the trails drawn in ink. But machines do not write captions any better than stones do. The interpretive labour remains human, and the political winds do not stop at the door of a lab. A library uploads a corpus of court records. A government quietly adjusts access a year later. A data set that might have anchored a curriculum becomes a dead link. Memory is a bandwidth problem as much as a budget one. What then can we promise in a series like this? Modesty and exactness. On screen we will show the documents we cite. We will distinguish between a chronicler's boast and an excavator's layer. We will say scholars disagree when they do and say why. We will resist round numbers unless they are the round numbers in the source we are quoting. We will give reading lists that do not all agree with each other. We will transparently mark where moral clarity is compatible with evidentiary caution and where it is not. We will also refuse the zero-sum game that asks us to set one atrocity against another as if grief were a contest with medals. There is one more custodian beyond paper and policy: descendants, and where descendants are few, caretakers. The Parsis who kept a fire that crossed the sea, the monks who sing, in a language their grandchildren do not speak, families in Balkan valleys who still ring a bell for a feast that used to be a procession, archivists who learn to say no to a minister, a teacher who covers this lesson because a student asked and because no textbook will. These are not plot devices, they are the reason the boxes open at all. We will carry these rules into the last room where we lay the gears side by side. The soldier forged from a child levy, the caravan that counts bodies and losses with the same pen, the room by the cataract where an operation makes a gatekeeper and a grave, the table that moves a farm from one column to another, the school and temple turned into something else, the market that prices youth in season, and the archive that remembers in spite of what it was designed to forget. In the final part, we will ask what all this reveals about power's preferences and the strange, stubborn ways memory survives power at all. Lay the gears on a table and you can see how they mesh. A levy that turns sons into servants of a palace, a caravan economy that moves bodies like commodities and prices loss into the trip, a room by the cataract where a knife produces a gatekeeper and a grave, a tax table that buys conversion with remission and sells tomorrow with inheritance, a library that burns and a temple that becomes a different temple so that calendars change without a vote, a market where girls are sorted like cloth and a household ledger that folds their names into purchases of sugar and silk. None of these devices explains the whole. Together, they explain durability. A system that feeds its own parts can last longer than outrage. The competitor's narration took a victory lap of numbers, and there is a certain relief in totals because arithmetic feels like closure. We have stayed closer to shapes, selection and erasure, premium and penalty, ash and ledger. From those shapes we can see design features. 1. The preference for interchangeability. People moved into roles defined by function rather than kin. 2. The preference for untraceability. Institutions that do not produce descendant communities who can insist on memory. Castration is the bluntest instrument here, but not the only one. Absorption of women into households where children do not form independent lineages. Attrition on routes and in camps that reduces survivors. Fiscal and legal pressure that unthreads property from confession over generations. Language policy that moves a mother tongue from market to choir and then to silence. It is not an accident that in the regions and periods where these practices were thick, memory is thin. You can read intention or you can read habit. The effect is the same. Fewer voices left to speak. Place these devices beside other empires' engines and differences sharpen without dissolving likeness. Roman latifundia mowed through peasantries. Chinese corvée bent villages to roads and walls. The Atlantic plantation made a short corridor into a furnace, and despite everything, left descendants who sing their history back into the record. Here the network stretched longer in time and wider in terrain, and many of their end-use institutions, households, inner courts, barracks, were designed to absorb rather than advertise. The universals we can name without hedging are bureaucratic, ledgers that turn suffering into routine, regulations that make coercion visible but normal, receipts that leave everyone feeling they have paid a bill rather than witnessed a theft. The particulars we must keep saying aloud are regional and chronological. Not every governor humiliated, not every levy was annual, not every library burned, Not every household enslaved women, but enough did, often enough, for the patterns to print like a watermark across centuries. The temptation now is to claim a moral of progress, to point to decrees and reforms in the last imperial centuries, to international treaties, to police forces that call trafficking by its name, and to pronounce the arc of history cured. The better lesson is less consoling and more useful. Systems are patient. They prefer ordinary days to crises. They survive by distributing rewards, promotion from the palace school, stipends for regimented loyalty, manumission as a carrot, alongside punishments, by recruiting some from the ranks of those coerced, by turning liturgy and paperwork into theatre so efficient that people rehearse their own subordination and call it order. They end when other systems make them too expensive to maintain, when internal critics grow teeth, when solidarities that were not supposed to form do, and when the record of how they worked becomes common knowledge. Exposure is not a cure. It is a tool. There are reasons this story has felt absent. Some are structural, language barriers, archives distant from classrooms, syllabi whose hours are already spoken for. Some are political and economic, donors and ratings, diplomacy and fear, the hazard of speaking about any past that touches living identities. Some are intimate. It is easier to teach a history with descendants in the room to correct you and comfort you than a history designed to leave none. The remedy is not a counter-myth with louder numbers. It is precision that travels. Dates, decrees, routes, a tax receipt shown on screen, a photograph of a ledger line, a trench that demonstrates ash, a quotation in which a clerk says exactly what he meant. The work of remembrance is slow because it is granular. What to do with what we have opened? First, resist the zero-sum arithmetic of sorrow. Naming one system fully does not subtract value from another. If anything, it teaches what to watch for everywhere. Euphemism as policy, paperwork as violence, logistics as ethics. Second, return to the small evidence that undercuts grand forgetting. A monk's marginal village. A notary's note that a girl was manumitted and married after 10 years of service. A cadastral survey in which the old names vanish line by line, and the last entry in a community's book is the sale of candlesticks. Third, learn to read institutions as we have read caravans, by the losses they are willing to normalize. What is an acceptable dropout rate? A natural attrition, a customary humiliation. The phrase is doing work. The ledger knows what. We are not, finally, talking about one civilization's essence. We are talking about a set of imperial technologies, legal, fiscal, martial, domestic, that many civilizations have used, and that, in the domains we traced, were articulated in the languages and laws of Islam, because those were the languages of rule. Inside those languages were also the arguments against the practices. Inside those courts were judges who constrained. Inside those communities were consciences that said no. If we leave that out, we slander the past as a monolith. If we leave them victims out in the name of balance, we commit the erasure we claim to resist. The only stable ground is to show both, how the machine worked and how some hands reached into it to jam the gears. The last task belongs not to the past, but to us, to hold the images long enough that they do not blur into a single outrage. Keep separate the square where boys are measured and renamed, the marsh where salt ate through skin and patience, the door at the cataract where survival bought a premium that could not pay for the dead, the tax bench where a father's kneeling taught his son math, the scriptorium where a language was copied as if sound alone could keep it alive, the courtyard where a girl was purchased and then, years later, signed her own deed of freedom with a hand that had learned to write. When you remember them together, do not let them merge into thunder. Let them remain rooms with walls and dates and doors. That is how you honour specificity without losing pattern. We will leave you with quiet things because quiet things last. A bell rung on a feast day in a Balkan parish, louder now than the census says it should be. A Parsi fire that crossed a sea and is still tended. A hymn sung in a language understood by fewer every year, and still sung anyway. A ledger page scanned and put online by an archivist who knows controversy will follow and uploads it regardless because paper should be common. A teacher who builds a week into her course plan for a history no textbook gives her. None of these unmake what was done. All of them keep forgetting from finishing its work. If you share this story, share it as mechanics, not as accusation, so that when the next system begins to price loss as normal, we recognize the smell. If you teach it, teach the receipts. If you study it, carry the 3 boxes: evidence, inference, allegation, like tools and not like weapons. History cannot punish or absolve. It can train vision. And once you see how interlocking devices turn breath into columns and columns into silence, you will be harder to govern by ledger. We have set the gears on the table. We have watched them turn. You know, now, what their teeth are made of.